Good evening. Action. Good evening. Really good to see so many people here. Really thrilled to be introducing the new exhibition from Ear to Ear to Eye. I think there are a few new faces. I'm Sam. I'm the director. This is Angelica, who's been working on the exhibition with me. We are going to try to introduce the exhibition and then talk you through it artist by artist, work by work. There's quite a lot of work in the exhibition, so we're trying to make sure it's 15 minutes per gallery, something like that. Just jump in with questions as we go along. I think that's probably the best way. What else to say? There are exhibition notes available. Have you seen them already?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, good. And basically what that does is to reproduce the wall text and so on. It's got a little bit of additional information, but kind of background for all of the work, and the artist is in the exhibition notes. So, From Ear to Eye is a group exhibition. It's an exhibition about music, about sounds, and about listening in all kinds of different forms. It traces the kind of lives, or the acoustic lives of different cities and places across the Arab world. So there are about almost 20 artists and researchers brought together for the exhibition. And they are from a whole range of places, from Lebanon to Egypt to Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, other places beyond, and many of them are working kind of outside of that region too. The title for the exhibition, From Ear to Eye, comes from an unpublished poem by the Egyptian artist Anna Bourguignon, and it's kind of part of a larger text about the ways in which kind of sound moves across borders, connects things, draws borders as well. And I guess these are kind of some of the themes of the exhibition, the ways in which kind of sound and music can trace different forms of movement, migration, different kind of ways of thinking about memory, of experience, of identity, and so on. So for me, the exhibition kind of came out of, I started to spend a lot of time traveling within the Arab world, probably about 10 years ago now. And a number of the artists in the exhibition are kind of people I met on those initial trips, and then people I've kind of met in more recent years as well. So yeah, is there anything else to say by way of introduction?
I mean, I think one of the things that has come up a couple of times is people have asked if it's a sound art show. It's not. I think we're talking about sound in a different way. We're talking about, as Sam said, like the way that sound kind of traces borders, talking about territories, forensic evidence, as we'll kind of see as we go through. So there are a lot of elements of sound, but that's not the crux of the show. It kind of moves beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's an exhibition that encompasses film, installation, photography, a photographic archive, sound pieces as well, but then also fabric works, astroturf, fragrance, a whole range of other things too.
Yep.
So that's the exhibition. So I should say, it's across the galleries. They're not tightly themed at all. The galleries don't have individual titles. You'll see a kind of like rough, like loose threads in each. And I would say that the first is really about the ways in which recording, or kind of like deep listening, or even forensic listening or analysis kind of might function in different contexts, from kind of political to legal. So this opening work that we're kind of standing in the midst of is by Lawrence Abu Hamdan. Lawrence is a kind of an artist and researcher. He was born in Jordan, but he grew up in Yorkshire. And he calls himself a private ear rather than a private eye. That is, he kind of sees himself as an investigator, often someone who is commissioned by different NGOs, from Amnesty, or in this case, it's a human rights charity called like Defense of Children, I believe, to investigate different cases that kind of hinge on sound in some respect. So the background for this installation, which is called Earshot, and has a video that's not currently playing, called Rubber Coated Bullets, started in about 2014, when Lawrence was approached by this human rights charity to look into a case that had, kind of an episode in 2014 It happened when there was a protest in the West Bank, in the occupied West Bank, that had resulted in the deaths of 2 unarmed Palestinian teenagers. The Israelis alleged that it wasn't them, that live ammunition had not been fired, and that actually they'd been firing rubber bullets into the crowd. Lawrence was able to basically analyze the sound recordings of this incident and produce these visual representations of the recordings. So each of these is a different sound file, or it's called a spectrogram. And he was able, by analysing these different spectrograms, to show that actually live ammunition had been fired, and that the sounds themselves are being doctored by the Israeli troops to make it appear as though rubber bullets have been fired. So what we're kind of standing within here, and this becomes much clearer when the video is on, is a kind of shooting range. So the whole piece itself encompasses this kind of metal hanging system, which mimics the kinds of ways in which targets are hung at a shooting range. And as you'll see in the video, each of these kinds of sound recordings or pieces of evidence is then brought up to the viewer or shooter to analyse. Each of them are different, and depending on the shape of them, you can see some are live ammunition, some are rubber bullets, some are live ammunition with a silencer to make it kind of sound as though it is a rubber bullet. There's a somewhat complex system within the space for the positioning of the works, which I'm going to leave it to Angelica.
Yeah. So the positioning is based on the distance that each of these types of, the sound of each of these types of ammunition travels in a certain space of time. So given the size of the room, it calculates how far in, I can't remember what it is, it's something like a tenth of a second each of the sound waves of these particular things travel. So the thing that you get first is the one here, which is a sound bomb, which they talk about in the film as using to disguise the sound of other ammunition. And the things that travel quickest are the ones at the back, which are the shots that were fired with a silencer and with a rubber bullet adapter. So there's quite a reasonably complicated algorithm that you use for working out where each particular one sits.
But so important to know, as Angelica says, that the fastest moving bullets are at that end of the gallery and the slow ones this end. So the video itself is really concise and super clear, and it makes this very clear. And so it's worth then mentioning that Lawrence's kind of research into these events actually resulted in it going to court and the Israeli admitting guilt within this. So Lawrence's work often has this kind of, he talks about the work having a kind of double life, functioning both in a kind of gallery context as an installation, but also in the kind of legal or political context as pieces of evidence. So it's a kind of tribunal, let's say. Because we're so many, I think we probably shouldn't all go into both of these spaces, but I'll maybe just introduce them and you can just put your head in so you can kind of see what's happening. Yeah.
Before we do that, I need to change your memory card.
Okay, we need to change memory card first.
And his young family decided to emigrate and come to London. So he's been in London since 1992, and he brought all that he could carry. Now, some of the photographs that you see, just a couple, are from the archive that prints this large vinyl and the small image over there. The others on the walls are taken by me. The slideshow combines the archives, but also has some images that are taken by me in Lebanon. So you can see these ideas, these metaphors of the cycle of water, the fog, the river, the sea, that I guess metaphorically relates to the ideas of migration, but also to memory. And just coincidentally, this water that you can see there is the same water that is in these photographs. It's literally photographed from Beirut's Corniche, so there is a geographical kind of link there. These objects here are from the National Museum in Beirut. It's one of the oldest tree trunks olive tree trunks found in Lebanon. That is like over 1,000 years old. This thing is part of the antique sculpture that during the civil wars, when the museum was bombarded and was on fire, some of the antiquities melted down, so that's part of this kind of antique artifact. That there is a stain from the photographs from the surface of a print that I've zoomed in. When I engaged with the DIAP's archive, I did all sorts of kind of really probing, almost forensic probing of the photographs. So I spent some time, a month, working with Arab Image Foundation in Beirut and with Ashkalavan, which is an organization that kind of trying to figure out what photographic archives are. And some of this practice involves using microscopes to kind of zoom into the surface of the photograph, so you can see that image here is extreme close-up, microscopic close-up, actually of this print here, so that's part of this man's face. And these are locations, these are mountains where a lot of the civil war, Lebanese civil war militia was hiding in. We see a lot of this particular, exactly these mountains in the original archival images, photographs in the slideshow. So if you happen to come here at the right time, you will see the corresponding images. Of course, you wouldn't know it, but without kind of being told, but these are the same places. And finally, that last picture is of the Beirut city wall. A lot of Beirut is scarred by the bullet holes. It's either really scarred by bullet holes or it's totally new, brand new, rebuilt, and beautiful and beautifully designed. So there is this strong contrast. But what really struck me about that is some artist intervention, that a lot of amazing people, designers, artists are working to kind of intervene with this kind of ruined city and create positive messages. And so this kind of lines of drawing an artist intervention. There are over 1,000 images altogether here in the slideshows. They are timed in such a way that you can kind of never see them at the same time together with the same pairing, in theory. I mean, I'm not a mathematical genius, but I hope that you can never see the same combination. So that's it, I think, more or less. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anya. Thank you. So yeah, as Anya says, there are kind of different elements here down the middle, the kind of these the archive photos themselves, which have then prints of the backs of the images, which often have kind of quite telling or surprising information, maybe the date of when it was taken or the location and so on. And then the pencil markings on the piece of white paper are actually Anya's own, and they respond to your the ways in which you were categorizing the archive itself, right, as you were working through the images.
So they're kind of obscure for anybody who doesn't know them, and we're not going to explain it. We've decided we're not going to make labels corresponding, because I think what we were interested here is just convey this idea that any archive is kind of
it's like
either order or disorder, yes, a mystery, and there is some kind of systematic attempt to systematically arrange it. But in a way, next person or next party or next institution would be swiping it all clean and rearranging it like according to their own agenda. So it doesn't need to be explained. But if you really wanted to kind of dig deep into it, that these kind of numbers and letters correspond to different chapters and different pages of the book. So as I was working with the designers and editors, we were using these codes to kind of group the images together before the publication of the book.
What time period does it cover here?
It covers about, like, the collected materials cover over 100 years. The oldest image we've got, actually the oldest print, is this one. Is of Diab's great-grandfather as he emigrated from Lebanon to USA, and it's taken in Ellis Island on the kind of entry point to USA. There are some pictures here from Diab's family albums. There are some images of him as a really young man, but some of them, like these ones, are from collected kind of neighbors' albums, and they're much older. I mean, some of them are from 1913. So we've got, in a slideshow, you will see some Victorian, amazing kind of Victorian photographs. So, but I believe, as far as I know, approximately, this is the oldest picture, and it's from late 19th century, maybe.
Will the publication be available in the shop?
Yes.
Yes.
And
we haven't asked you this yet, Anya, but we were thinking about maybe having one of them here and kind of shrunk down.
Yeah,
so you can see that.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, Anya, thank you so much for springing that on you.
Well, that's fine. That's my pleasure. Thank you.
We'll move through to Gallery 3. You can see on your right that Lawrence's video is kind of now up and running, so you get a bit of a sense of how it's working.
Thank you.
Do you want to talk about these things?
No.
Yeah.
More of the same.
Are you doing tomorrow?
Yeah. So, into Gallery 3, which just in terms of kind of practical respects, we've made a really quite large projection space here behind, where there's a film by Jumana Mama. And then the space that you saw probably on the way in at the front, which is an installation of video by Basma Al-Sharif. And then within that, we've then got this kind of rectangular gallery with several things going on.
Maybe we can start with Marwa.
Sure, yeah.
Marwa Arsanios, who is based in Beirut.
Based in Beirut, in between.
So this film is kind of loosely about the kind of refuge crisis that they had in Beirut, which was in
About a year and a half, 2 years ago now, kind of trash crisis.
Yeah. So the film kind of talks about that, but it talks about the root of that. So what she's kind of addressing is how property developers were buying up land in Beirut, and they would turn the land into rubbish dumps, essentially, to devalue the land around it so that they could buy it up and build property on it. So this video is a sort of investigation into that process and into what's happened in that part of Beirut, and also references a lot what's been talked about by Anya, by Ziad, by Basma, which is this area of the Corniche in Beirut.
Kind of the promenade that runs along the coast. So yeah, as Angelica says, this kind of big property scam that's been going on in Beirut, and that resulted a couple of years back in this kind of real crisis moment. I went soon after, and some of the artists I was doing studio visits with were kind of literally ill because of the noxious fumes of the rubbish that had been piled up in the streets for weeks because of this kind of property.
Yeah, so then what happened is the rubbish dump will be closed at the point where they bought the land and wanted to develop, and then all of a sudden all of the rubbish dumps in Beirut were closing, so there's nowhere for refuge.
Yeah.
Riots, please.
Yeah, which we'll come on to. What next? Maybe
Basma?
Yeah, maybe So Basma Al-Sharif is through at the front. Probably your reason. So we should say that the lights aren't going to be this low in here. For some reason we can't turn those up. I don't know. So this is a work by Basma Al-Sharif. It's called The Story of Milk and Honey. And it has, so you can see, many different elements. There's a video which isn't on right now, hiding in the middle, framed in a similar way to these photos. The photos, as Angelica said, were taken along the Corniche, taken kind of in secret, so you have these slightly strange and cropped heads and people. These are then a combination of Basma's family photos with all the faces blurred out, but other photos too. And then you have these scans of a book about plants, and then you have Basma's own kind of plant sketches there too. All of this kind of becomes much clearer in this video, which is about 10 minutes long, something like that. It's a very kind of funny piece about Basma essentially trying to make an artwork, kind of thinking about the Middle East, but when she wasn't based there. I think she was living in LA when she made this.
Yeah, I think so. She's there.
She talks about wanting to kind of make a video that was a kind of love song to where she was from, and then absolutely failing to do it, and kind of cycling through all of these different kind of cliches as she sees them, of rubbing out the faces of family photos, or drawing plants and then taking photos along the corniche, or doing these kinds of different kinds of things and then realising they don't kind of work out. And the video, which kind of takes the form of a kind of voiceover with some of these images, says, and I tried this, and I tried this, and that wasn't working. So it's about trying to make this kind of video as love song and kind of failing, but maybe not failing along the way. She's shown this piece a couple of times before, and one of those times it had AstroTurf. And her kind of, I think there's a bit in the text about this, but she talks about really wanting to kind of deliberately over-exaggerate the exoticization of this piece, or even a kind of like self-orientalization of the work, kind of really wanting to kind of ramp it up. So the only element that's not yet finished is there'll be a combination of potted plants, both real and fake, in the space. She was very specific, I think 2 fake ones and 1 real one. That's the kind of ratio she's working to. So there'll be a stool here. Again, yeah, the music kind of plays quite a central role in the video. But it's a kind of, it's a very funny, quite sweet, poetic piece. And yeah, that's Basma. And again, I guess just as with Lawrence, the video kind of has a life of its own. With this one too, the video has been shown by itself, but it's the fuller form.
So this is a work by an artist called Munira Al-Sol, and it's a kind of, it's a part of an ongoing series called I Strongly Believe in Our Right to Be Frivolous. But it's its own separate kind of entity within that, and this sort of sequence of works is based on Munira's conversations with refugees, I think mainly Syrian refugees?
Mainly Syrian refugees, yes. She started to make them when she started to visit the camps in and around Beirut in about 2011 or 2012.
So all of them are based on conversations, and through the conversations she would have with different people, she would make drawings and kind of annotations on this yellow legal pad that she has. So the main kind of body of this series are a sequence of drawings and notations on this yellow kind of lined paper. And the embroideries here are translations of those drawings. So each of these, I think, is kind of based on a conversation with a different person. So we have translations of the ones that have Arabic on them, but also a little bit more detail from Munira about the particular stories of the refugees. So we'll have those laminated with the label here. So
because it's unfolded now over 5 or 6 years, and so it started in Beirut, but then she's since made them in Athens, where she was preparing for the Documenta exhibition that happened there this summer. Also Kassel, yeah, you'll see this pops up.
I think that happens every 5 minutes. Just as a warning.
So they're kind of portraits, and I suppose just as we were talking about Etel Adnan's leporellos as kind of forms of graphic forms of notation of conversations or fragments, these I think are also these kind of visual records of conversations.
And the embroideries themselves are made in collaboration with some female refugees she was working with.
So when she makes the drawing, she gives kind of one copy to the person she's been doing the portrait of, she keeps one, and then that gets made into a embroidery. And she's shown them both as the kind of works on paper and these fabric pieces too. And yeah, so we just have this kind of small selection of a much larger series, and it's a selection that Munira made. Talk about Hiwa?
Yeah, so Hiwa is a really interesting artist. He's an artist and a musician.
So flamenco guitarist.
And yeah.
And dancer as well.
And studied with what they call Paco Peña, who are quite a famous flamenco kind of duo. So he uses music quite a lot. This particular piece is Hiwa went to a protest in
a town or city called Suleimania, which is in the north of Iraq, Kurdish Iraq, which is where Hiwa is from. And actually, just to kind of jump back a bit, Hiwa left Iraq in the early mid-90s and actually travelled to Germany on foot, taking it over the course of a number of months. And lots of his subsequent works have been about that journey.
So in this particular piece, he went to a protest and he went with a friend, and they both took instruments with them and these kind of loudspeakers. And the piece, well, originally it wasn't intended as a kind of piece. They went there with the instruments, not really knowing what would happen. It was filmed while the protest took place, and the cameraman sent the film to Hiwa afterwards, so it kind of became this piece.
So he didn't choose to document it at all.
So they go through this protest playing a refrain that's called Once Upon a Time, or from a film called Once Upon a Time in the West. And
it's directed by
Sergio Leone.
Sergio Leone, and it's the famous soundtrack by Ennio Morricone. You can kind of hear the motif there. So they go just armed with a harmonica and a guitar and a megaphone, and slowly start to play this kind of motif that is used in the film to kind of build up tension. And they kind of play it over and over again. It's a very short video. It's on loop. It's about 5 minutes, and the protest gets violently dispersed, which you see happening now. It's got this quite enigmatic title, which is this
lemon taste
of apple. And that kind of connects two things. The first is that back in the late 80s, when Saddam Hussein was using gas against the Kurdish population of Iraq, it was said to smell like apples. And then in the protests of 2011, of which this is a partial document, protesters bit into lemons to counteract the sting of the tear gas. And so these two tastes, Hiwa tries to connect these kinds of history across a kind of 2-decade period, like lemons on the one hand, and then apples back in the late 80s. But it's a kind of very simple in a way, but very potent piece that I think you only really need a few moments to understand.
And you can kind of see there people are like handing out lemons, and they're squeezing lemons.
Hiwa is the guy who's playing the harmonica. Right. So the two videos. And then this kind of curious piece by Raya Jesse, who's an artist but also a musician. He runs this really great record label. He's in a duo called Fayed. And this has a sound element, which isn't on at the moment. And basically the sound element takes the form of a kind of remix that Riot has made of this record by Kulthum called The Ruins. Kulthum, many of you might know her music. She was an Egyptian singer. She's often kind of called the Egyptian Piaf. And she would do, through the 50s and 60s, kind of weekly concerts in Cairo that were broadcast nationally. And it's kind of said that the streets of Cairo would grind to a halt whenever Kulthum was singing. When she died in the mid-70s, some 4 million people attended her funeral. She sold like 80 million records. It's almost like hard to kind of overstate her importance as a singer. And this is probably one of her best-known records, The Ruins. And so you'll hear this kind of filtered, remixed kind of version playing out of her mouth. But then it takes a lot of Raed's work kind of traffics in fiction, or where kind of fiction meets personal or political histories. And the other part of the work involves these two texts, one on the left in Korean, and then the translation in English on the right. And it's this kind of fiction, or is it, piece about a concert that Umkapum did in 1967, that she tried to bounce via satellites to Korea, and thus become the first person to kind of play live in Korea. And then Raed makes out that this was maybe recorded, but was never properly released, but he came across this record on eBay in 2012, and then this is the record, and you can see that it's translated into Korean on the record. So as ever with like Raed's work, it's a kind of like, I'm not sure if that's true, but maybe partly it is kind of thing. And rereading the text today, I was thinking like, what elements of this are real? But it gives a very kind of clear, just account of this story. And so in this gallery, the sound will be this kind of remix of Unkaflung. Then there are these two short videos of Raed's, one with headphones, one without. The one without, as you've heard, just has this brief moment of music.
Yeah.
One's called disco, one's called karaoke.
Yeah. So I think the disco one is, again, it's this sort of fiction. It's about Raed's father, but Raed's father shares a name with a quite famous musician.
Yeah.
So the story kind of blurs between Raed's father and the musician, and there are these kind of moments of kind of family images, but also shots of the musician, and the two stories kind of merge together.
Yes. And the other one is about his, one's about his father, one's about his mother. But they're both kind of very short, almost like pop song length, using this kind of archive footage. Before we move into Gallery 4, shouldn't forget to mention Jemana Mana's film through there. Jemana, who some of you might have met, she's been around this last day or two, is a Palestinian artist, primarily a filmmaker, but also makes sculptural works too. So the works, this kind of, we should probably move that up. These vessels are also by Jemana. The film that's through here, quite a bit to unpack. It's a feature-length film. It's about an hour long, and it's retracing the steps of a German ethnomusicologist, a guy who is not very well known at all. He was called Robert. His name is Robert Lachman, and in the 20s and 30s he was working in Palestine as a musicologist. He also had a radio show on what's the name of the show itself was called Oriental Music, and it was on a kind of British-run radio station in Palestine, because at the time it was a British mandate. And he would travel all around Palestine talking to people from different kind of religious groups and recording the music, and he would broadcast this weekly on this radio show. So Jemana's film, which kind of features her, she is retracing the footsteps of Lachman in present-day kind of Israel and the West Bank. She herself is from East Jerusalem, and some elements are filmed in her family home in East Jerusalem. And you'll see her speaking both Hebrew and Arabic throughout the film, talking to people in their own homes as they kind of sing some of these songs or respond to some of the recordings that Lachman made 80 years ago. So it's very much a kind of revisiting 80 years on of this kind of attempt to categorize people, communities, by way of music. I would say it's a kind of very critical take on that anthropological attempt to kind of divide people up, communities up, by the kinds of music or sounds that they make. But it's a very lush, kind of very beautiful film that's kind of full of different songs from different kinds of historical moments, different kind of geographical periods and so on. So yeah, it is just over an hour long, but it's something that I think can be just seen in sections of it as well. So that's Jemana's film. This is a sculptural work by her.
It's called Stage for Any Sort of Revolutionary Play. And it's not directly related to the film, but it does have kind of loose associations with that. So all of the vessels take the form of kind of parts of the body. And what she's sort of talking about is the body as a kind of resonating body as a resonating device, and so she imagines these kind of vessels almost as musical instruments, or as places that air passes through and sounds and noise develops.
There's a quote from her here. She says, "The sculptures are vessels similar to our bodies that may be filled with fluids, air or sound. Sound is taking place in space, but is also spreading within us." And the title of the film in here is "The Magical Substance Flows Into Me." So there's this kind of sense of our own bodies as like resonating vessels that I think connects the two works. Any questions before we move on? Okay, to Gallery 4. Before we get started in here, Sam just asked what was going on with the steps that lead up to Germano's stage, and I think it's just that the title itself describes the work as a stage, and she talks about it as these kinds of things having kind of walked up, or kind of wobbled or danced up onto the stage itself. So that's how she described it. So now we are in Gallery 4, and all of the works in this section, this side of the wall, are by Heig, who again has been around for this last day or two. Heig is an artist, a researcher, a curator who's based between Beirut and Berlin. For the last few years he's been embarking on this kind of, he tends to work in kind of episodes of research, or like chunks or chapters of research. And each one looks at a different way in which music, or kind of a musical tradition, migrates around the world. So to give one example, one was all about how the Armenians have really cornered the market in making hi-hats and cymbals, and that was because of a single Armenian family who set up a business in Manhattan in like 1915.
Zildjian.
Absolutely. And so he then kind of traces the kind of history of jazz as told through that. So that's kind of the way in which he works. The works themselves often take the form of sculptures, texts, performances, videos. And what we have here is a kind of almost complete chapter of work that's all about a master oud player. A guy whose name I'm blanking on now, but I think it was something like Kenkulian, I think. Who was living and working in Istanbul through the kind of 30s, 40s and 50s, and was a kind of leading figure in what was known at the time as kind of Turkish or Oriental art music. And this was a kind of hybrid form that mixed kind of classical Turkish folk music with kind of more like Western influences as well. And to kind of situate this in its historical context, after the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed and the modern Republic of Turkey was born. With that, it brought really radical language reforms and a kind of sense of trying to build a new modern state of kind of wiping out the vestiges of the Ottoman past. Music played a really important role in building up those kinds of borders, building up this kind of new national